Great. So thanks so much for including this paper on the agenda today. This is joint with Ben Faber, who I believe is on chat, ready and willing to answer your questions, Thibault Fally, Matthias Hoelzlein, Miguel, and Andrés Rodríguez-Clare. And as you may be able to tell, given the composition of co-authors, this paper is really an attempt to bring together toolkits from two different disciplines, from micro development and from quantitative trade. And the big picture question that we're trying to answer here is, what should we expect treatment effects that are measured in small or local scale interventions? How should we expect those treatment effects to differ once those policies are scaled up to a national level and full general equilibrium? So we're looking at this question in the context of agricultural policy interventions. Now, I know I don't need to justify to you all why we're interested in ag. Of course, the majority of the world's poor are working in agriculture. And so interventions that are designed to increase agricultural productivity have really been central in the fight against global poverty. Now, increasingly in recent years and decades, really, we've been getting increasing information on the efficacy of these policies from both field experiments and natural experiments. We have much better causally identified evidence on the efficacy of these programs. However, one challenge of many, though certainly not all these field experiments, is many of them are implemented in small scale. So often as pilots in anticipation of, say, a national roll-up. And the challenge is that findings that are based on local variation often are unable to speak to the general equilibrium effects that would emerge if these interventions were to be scaled up to, say, a national level. So just to fix ideas, imagine, for example, that you're running a small-scale RCT of a fertilizer subsidy program. This is a very common program that you see in developing countries in agricultural sectors. So imagine you run the small-scale RCT, you might find that as a result of this fertilizer subsidy program, farmers use more fertilizer, their yields go up, their revenues go up. However, if you were to scale this up to the national level, you might find that output prices could drop, input prices could rise, treatment effects could be quite different. Now, we're of course not the first to make that qualitative point that treatment effects can look different at scale, but if you want to actually quantify this and put a number on how should we expect these treatment effects to look at scale, then you have to take seriously measuring some pretty complicated GE forces. And these forces are going to be a function of the pre-existing geography of who's growing what where, the pre-existing geography of consumption, who's consuming what where, the nature of trade frictions, how are prices propagated throughout the economy, pass through both within and across markets, etc. So what we're going to do in this paper is develop a new methodology for quantifying these general equilibrium policy counterfactuals with the goal of complementing the really nice and growing stock of evidence coming from local interventions. So we're going to make four main contributions in this paper. The first will be developing a rich but tractable quantitative general equilibrium model of farm production and trade. So I mean rich in a couple senses. So first, we're going to estimate this model not at the level of cross-country trade or even cross-region trade, but down to the level of the individual household. That's done for two reasons. First, we want to look at distributional effects. How are, say, the poor affected relative to the wealthy? And second, that's to match the unit of observation that's often measured in these RCTs. We're also going to be making several departures from the sort of traditional or workhorse gravity structure to capture stylized facts that we think are quite important for getting quantifiable numbers right in the agricultural setting. The most important of these departures is that unlike sort of the typical quantitative trade models, the gravity structures that tend to assume, for example, if you're looking at cross-country trade, you're looking at trade and manufacturing goods, they tend to assume product differentiation. And the implication of that is you're going to see positive trade flows between every country. Every country is going to trade at least something with every other country. In our context, we're looking at first agricultural commodities, so they're much more homogeneous. And second, we're looking at the individual household level. Okay, so it's certainly not the case that every individual in the economy is trading with every other individual. So what that means is our trade flow matrix is going to have lots of zeros in it, and it's not going to be invertible. That's going to mean we can't, from observing trade flows, we can't back out underlying primitives on trade costs. And so it means it's going to be difficult to run counterfactuals in this setting. So we're going to show that you have to bring a new solution method to solve for counterfactuals in this environment. And specifically, you have to know much more information about the baseline equilibrium. Most importantly, you have to know prices for every agent and every good in the economy. And that's, of course, that's a huge data burden. And so we're going to show how you can actually solve for those prices using data that's much more readily available as part of our model solution. And that's going to allow us to solve for counterfactuals without assuming structural gravity. We'll be looking at this in the context of Uganda. And so we're going to calibrate this model to the 6 million households that are populating Uganda. Here we'll use pretty rich microdata, administrative microdata, but we'll try to stick to data that's primarily pretty widely available, again, with the goal of this being a toolkit that can be ported to other settings. There'll be one exception to that, and I'll try to highlight that as we go through the data. And then fourth, we're going to try to bring in the strengths from the applied micro development literature in terms of identifying identification. And we will be identifying key model parameters, key supply and demand elasticities using RCTs and natural experiments. And we'll also use natural experiments for model validation. Okay, so we're going to build up this machinery. What are we going to use it to do? So we're going to primarily run two main counterfactuals through our model. In the first counterfactual, we're going to simulate treating 10,000 households with a productivity shock that will be akin to a fertilizer subsidy program. Again, this is a policy that actually the Ugandan economy or the Ugandan government's currently considering doing. So first is a local intervention in which we treat 10,000 households through our model. And the second is a scaled intervention in which we treat the entirety of the rural economy. And we're going to ask is how do those same 10,000 households, how do they fare in the local intervention versus the scaled? What I find is the average welfare effects can differ substantially by up to plus minus 10 percentage points difference in welfare. So very different treatment effects at scale. We're also going to find distributional effects can really vary. So we'll find this, this treatment is quite regressive in the local intervention, benefiting the wealthy much more than the poor, but significantly less so at scale. And we'll discuss the channels for that. Second, we're going to ask how do these differences behave as a function of national saturation rate? So this is designed to speak to a new but growing approach coming from the applied development literature that tries to capture GE effects experimentally. So the approach here is called a randomized saturation design. So for those who are unfamiliar, you would randomize not just say which farmers get the subsidy, but you'd also randomize at a higher level, say a village level, the percentage of farmers who are getting this treatment. Okay? So you might in some villages treat 20% of farmers and others 60%, and that's going to allow you to look at outcomes on things like market prices. Now this is a very useful approach. It's one I've actually used in the past in my own work. But one of the challenges that I found at least is when you talk to policymakers and you say, here's what happens at 20% saturation, here's what happens at 60, what they want to know, of course, is what happens when you go all the way out to 100. And to answer that, you have to extrapolate and make assumptions about, certainly monotonicity, but also linearity of the treatment effects. We can, through the lens of our model, we can ask, what do these GE effects look like as a function of saturation? Simulating treating 10, 20, all the way out to 100% of the population. And what we find, much to, frankly, my dismay as someone who uses this technique a lot, is that GE forces can be not just nonlinear, but in fact, even non-monotonic. And we'll talk about why. We do a bunch of other interesting stuff that I won't have time to discuss in the main presentation, but happy to chat about during the Q&A. I think for the sake of time, I'll also skip over the related literature. This is obviously pulling from a bunch of different fields and a bunch of work of folks who are on this call today. So we're excited to get your feedback. Okay, so quickly on the data and the stylized facts. So for the data, as Mike mentioned, many folks are using here these LSMS surveys. So we're also using Uganda's National Panel Survey, which is their LSMS. We'll be using 1 year of the full population census, which is quite useful for getting every individual in the economy into this model. Some pretty standard GIS data, things like the road network in Uganda, world prices, weather shocks, etc. The one data set that's a little bit more unique is data that actually I've collected in another project in Uganda with my co-author Craig McIntosh. And as part of that project, Craig and I have collected for 260 markets around Uganda. We've collected market prices over the course of about 3 years. And what's unique, at least for this project, is we also have trade flows. So from doing trader surveys, we know which markets are actually connected and trading with each other. That will be very useful when it comes to calibrating trade costs. Quickly on basic context, the model will include the 9 major crops that account for the vast majority of what's grown in Uganda. If you look at a map of Uganda, you see lots of regional specialization. That combined with high intranational trade costs lead to large regional price variation. Okay, let me quickly describe sort of the four main stylized facts that are going to, we think, be important for getting the setting right. So the first is the one I already described, of product differentiation. So it looks like crops are mostly non-differentiated across farmers. So for example, we can look at that data that Craig and I collected, and we see that fewer than 5% of markets are actually directly trading with each other. So there'll be lots of zeros in that trade flow matrix. Stylized fact 2 is on household preferences. So we see clear evidence that demand is non-homothetic. Again, no surprise to this audience, but here if you draw an angle curve, you see the poor spending a much larger fraction of their expenditure on food than the wealthy. That's going to have implications when we look at, for example, the distributional impacts of changing food prices. Third, on the nature of trade costs. So it's common in these models to model trade costs as ad valorem or iceberg, as a fraction of the value of what's being shipped. We're going to see clear evidence, again, coming from that market price and trade flows data, that it looks like these trade costs are much better modeled as additive. That's been implications for how prices are passed through in the economy. So ad valorem implies perfect pass-through, additive, imperfect. So this is going to matter for how prices propagate through our network. And then finally, stylized fact 4 is on the production function. So we'll see that it looks like adopting modern techniques. And by modern techniques here, I mean inorganic fertilizer, improved seeds. This is more complicated than a Hicks neutral productivity shock. We see in our data evidence that, that those households that are using modern techniques are also using a higher labor share relative to land. This is going to mean that when we feed a shock into the model of encouraging people to use more modern techniques, we might see effects on things like labor demand and therefore on wages. Okay, so let me ambitiously try to describe the entire model in a single slide. This model, the sort of the big picture takeaway here is this model is really trying to capture down to the individual level the sort of rich geography of production and consumption across the country. So there'll be two kinds of agents in our model. Farmers who live in rural areas and urban households who of course live in urban areas. Two kinds of markets, villages and urban centers. And there'll be a foreign agent who lives at the border post around Uganda and stands for the rest of the world. Trade in this network is going to happen along sort of the actual road graph that describes Uganda, and there'll be two different layers to our trade network. So in the local layer, farmers are going to trade with their local village market and urban households with their local urban center. And then there'll be a second layer of trade that connects across markets, as well as with these border posts. And at both of those layers, we're going to have transaction costs, trade costs, either additive and or ad valorem. So what's being traded? There'll be two kinds of outputs. So up to those 9 agricultural goods that I mentioned, as well as a single manufacturing good. Two kinds of tradable inputs, so intermediate goods and labor. Land will also be used in the production of agricultural goods. And you'll see sometimes we'll use G as a generic index denoting all tradable goods, all tradable outputs and inputs. So farmers on the production side, farmers are going to own Z units of land and L units of labor. A few notes on the model. So Z in our model currently is not tradable. We think that's reflective of what would likely happen in terms of a fertilizer subsidy program, but that's something we can adjust in the model. Labor is going to be tradable locally. So what that means is farmers can buy or sell labor. So again, we can see effects on labor demand, effects on wages. We're currently shutting down mobility and labor at that second layer of the network across markets. So we're shutting down migration. Again, that's something we can discuss and potentially relax. Urban households, much simpler. On the urban side, urban households simply own labor and they're producing a single manufacturing good using that labor. Okay, so we're going to build up this model, and then what we want to do is introduce counterfactual shocks into the model. So what we're going to shock in this model is a shock to farmer productivity, again, akin to some sort of intervention that's increasing farmer productivity. So we're going to shock this B term here, which is going to be farmer productivity shifters in our model. But I just want to note that this methodology can also be used for a wider range of shocks. So for example, this could be used for interventions that are shocking, say, household preferences, which in our model will be this A term here, this taste shifter. So you could think, for example, of interventions that are maybe informing households about the nutritional content of different foods, for example. You could also think about feeding in shocks to trade costs. This here is our ad valorem and our additive trade cost. So you can think, for example, about road building exercises. And just quick notation, these hats denote the new value, the counterfactual value over the old baseline value. Okay, so what's the major complication for solving for counterfactuals in this setting? So the major complication is that although household behavior is invertible, the trade block is not. So what I mean by that is in terms of household behavior being invertible, so in our model, if you observe some pretty basic data on the consumption side, if you observe income and expenditure shares, you can back out primitives on the demand side. Conversely, on the production side, if you observe some basic data like revenue shares coming from different crops, you can back out primitives on the production side. We'd like to do the same on the trade side. We'd like to say if you observe trade flows, you know, let's invert it and back out trade costs, but we can't because we're looking at these homogeneous goods and that trade flow matrix is not going to be invertible. So just to build some intuition, imagine, for example, that, you know, what we're observing at baseline, imagine we observe that at baseline, market A is trading with market B, but not with market C. So the challenge is we know that it's not profitable for markets A and C to be trading at baseline, but we don't know how close is it to being profitable. So we don't know if we feed, say, is it very close? So if we feed a small counterfactual shock into the model, they might start trading, or are they very far away from being profitable? So even a big shock is not going to make them start trading. We don't know. And so what we show is that you need to bring more information to bear to answer these, to solve for these counterfactuals. And specifically what you need to know is first, the trade costs between markets A and C. And second, the prices in market A and market C at baseline. Then you can actually solve for counterfactuals in that environment. So to see that, that's the intuition. To see that more formally, let me show you the counterfactual equilibrium. So this is just showing you an equilibrium in this context is going to be a set of prices P and trade flows X that satisfy three conditions. So this first condition up here is just the excess demand condition, saying that excess demand for individual households and for individual goods have to equal the value of the total amount bought and minus the total amount sold for each individual, as well as for the foreign agent. That's the second bit here. We also have some standard market clearing conditions, as well as no arbitrage conditions. There's a lot going on here in this slide. The only thing I really want you to take away is sort of the color coding here. So what's here in red are either the shocks we're feeding into the model or the counterfactual values or changes that we're trying to back out, and that's in red. What's in blue here is the data that we need to solve the model. And crucially, just note that these prices, the prices for each agent J and good G, are still showing up at baseline, are still showing up in this counterfactual equilibrium. Okay, so we're going to need those prices as well as these trade costs to actually back out our equilibrium. Okay, so there'll be three steps to doing this. So the first is we're going to calibrate trade costs. So here we're going to use that data that I mentioned on prices and trade flows. So for a subset of markets in Uganda, we know if they're actually trading and we know the prices in those markets. So we can restrict our attention to markets that we know to be trading. We can apply a no arbitrage condition to say that the gap in prices we observe is equal to trade costs for those markets that are trading. Now it's only for a subset of markets, so we'll have to project that onto distance and then predict trade costs for the rest of the Ugandan network. We do something similar for the second local layer for households. Second, we're going to then solve for prices in a price discovery step. So once we have those calibrated trade costs and we know some basic data on the geography of production and consumption, then we can back out prices. And we can do this by essentially solving for the unobserved prices and trade flows that rationalize the existing distribution of production and consumption. And this is actually just very similar to solving for the equilibrium in a simple exchange economy. Okay, and then we can actually solve for counterfactuals. Very quickly, just on how we take this model to the data. So I've already mentioned, I think, roughly how we calibrate trade costs. The input cost shares we can just read off of the data that we have. Let me quickly mention on our key supply and demand elasticities. So kappa is our key supply elasticity. And so here we're going to estimate this using a natural experiment with world coffee prices. So Uganda is a major, most of what Uganda produces, they export about 95% of what they produce, but they're relatively small, they account for a relatively small portion of world supply, only about 2%. So you can think of world coffee prices as relevant but exogenous to Uganda. So we're going to use world coffee price changes as an instrument to see how farmers reallocate their land, and as a result, how their yields change. and that's going to allow us to estimate this key supply elasticity. On the demand side, we're going to here use an RCT to estimate demand. This is coming from actually another project of mine in neighboring Kenya, in which we essentially run an experiment where we randomize the price or a subsidy or a discount to price to consumers, and we measure the corresponding quantities they buy at those prices. Okay, so my last 5 minutes, let me quickly show you some results. So just to clarify, just to remind you that the counterfactual analysis that we're going to run here is we're going to feed into the model a productivity shock. This is calibrated to be equivalent to a 90% subsidy on intermediate prices, but you can think of this as just some shock to productivity and growing with modern techniques. We're going to then run 2 counterfactuals. So the first of the local intervention. So this local intervention, we're going to simulate treating a representative random sample of 10,000 rural households. In the second intervention, we're going to simulate treating the entirety of the Ugandan economy, all farmers in the Ugandan economy. And we're going to ask, how do those same 10,000 households fare in the local intervention and at scale? And we'll do a bunch of other stuff, some of which I'll have time to get to, some of which I'm happy to discuss during the Q&A. Okay, so this figure here is showing you the average difference in the welfare change, i.e. the treatment effect, between the local intervention and the scaled intervention for the 810 sub-counties around Uganda. So just to take one concrete example, imagine you were to run your RCT out here to the right. What this is saying is the treatment effect that you would estimate in your RCT in the local intervention is going to be 10 percentage points greater than what you would estimate, than what you would find in terms of the treatment effect for these same people at scale. So I want to be clear, this is not about treatment heterogeneity. This is saying for the same people in your study, the treatment effect they're going to experience at scale is going to be 10 percentage points lower. Conversely, if you run your experiment over here, what this is saying is the treatment effect you're going to estimate in your local intervention is going to be 10 percentage points greater than what you're going to estimate at scale. Okay? So this is basically saying that local and at scale effects can really differ substantially. And if you ran your intervention in one given area, not only are you not getting sort of the average at scale effect, but you're not even potentially getting right the scale effect for the people that you're studying as GE prices shift things around. Quickly, I should say, what you might want to know what accounts for folks being out here in the tails. These areas out here in the tails where they're really buffeted by these strong GE forces tend to be those that are in more remote areas that tend to be less linked to export markets and therefore are having stronger price effects in their local economy. We can also look at distributional effects. So this is showing you the change in welfare, again, the treatment effect for the local intervention here in blue and the at scale intervention here in red along the income distribution, which we're proxying for by years of education. So this is showing you the distributional effects are quite regressive in the local intervention. So the wealthy are benefiting much more than the poor. And the reason for that is simple. The wealthy tend to use more fertilizer at baseline. So for a fertilizer subsidy program, that's benefiting the wealthy more than the poor. At scale, it's much less regressive. So still regressive, but much less so. And what's happening there is twofold. So first, the poor tend to spend a relatively larger fraction of their income on food, and food prices are falling. And second, the poor tend to get a relatively larger fraction of their income from labor compared to land, and wages are going up. Just very quickly, second, we look at how GE forces vary as a function of scale. So again, we can simulate treating 10, 20, all the way out to 100% of farmers. What we find is that the treatment effects, the welfare effects for those original 10,000 farmers are falling up until about 60% saturation, and then they're actually rising again. So we are still investigating what could be explaining this, but one hypothesis just to throw out there is it's possible that these farmers are shifting from being net producers to net consumers of these goods as the price is falling. We do a bunch of work on robustness and model validation. So we look at alternative parameter assumptions. We look to see how well we're matching cross-sectional moments that we didn't target in the calibration, including some price data we have that we don't use in our calibration. And we're in the process, and I think this will be very important once we complete it, we're in the process of looking at natural experiments and what we see in reduced form from those compared to our model. So we're looking at 2 different natural experiments. One is of new roads that were built throughout Uganda in this 15-year period. And the second is looking at weather shocks. And we want to see how well our model is capturing the GE forces coming from those shocks. So let me conclude. So as I mentioned, agricultural policies, we're increasingly getting more information from field experiments on the impact of these policies. But of course, there's some well-known limitations of small-scale experiments informing policy at scale. So we're trying to explore these forces through the lens of a quantitative GE model of farm production and trade. And let me end by saying we really have sort of two main objectives with this paper. The first is to investigate and quantify these general equilibrium forces using a combination of theory and data. And the second is much more practical, to provide a toolkit that can complement results from local RCT interventions. So if you have a well-identified local treatment effect, how do we go beyond sort of just throwing up our hands and saying, well, we don't know what this would look like at scale? How do we bring in theory? How do we bring in admin data to make quantifiable predictions for what those treatment effects should look like at scale? Okay, so let me stop there.
All right. Thank you. I want to start out by congratulating Lauren on doing that in 25 minutes. This is a incredibly big and in-depth paper. So really 25 minutes doesn't do it justice. I really recommend that people pay attention to this and read the draft because there's so much going on in it. So there's, a very complex model that's super rich that allows for all kinds of things. They calibrate it. They're doing serious data work. There are envelope theorems all over the place. So there's a lot going on in this paper. I think this paper is great. It's extremely ambitious. I think the solution method is potentially really powerful. And so, yeah, 25 minutes is impressive to get through this. What I'm going to do is to just make a few comments. Then I'm going to invite Lauren to respond. So she can, if I pose something as a question, she can answer it if she wants to. I noticed that Ben, like me, has gotten up early on West Coast time and is answering questions in the chat. So if you have some questions that you want to write out, you can address them there as well. And if you want to ask a question to the whole group, I'd recommend that maybe we can just do it where you just say I have a question, and when we get to you, then I'll just call on you to ask your question. So as I'm talking and then Lauren's responding, feel free to just state if you have a question. Okay, so I'm just going to say a few things about how sort of my reaction to the paper. I think obviously the major theme is to think about how interventions at scale differ from interventions that are done at the micro level, how to use that kind of micro level results to predict the at scale effects, taking into account general equilibrium forces and so on. And I think this is great because I think something that's sort of missing in the development literature along these lines is sort of like a canonical model. Like I do a lot of trade. So it's like in trade, we've got our canonical models. We've got the Mellitz model. And if you're presenting to a trade audience and you get up and say, I'm going to present an augmented Mellitz model that's augmented along some dimension, most of the people in the audience are going to be 90% of the way there in terms of understanding what you're trying to do. And if we had a tool like that in development for understanding these kind of at-scale exercises, that's going to be extremely powerful. And in macro, they have the neoclassical growth model and so on. So a lot of literatures have these types of canonical models. And so we could very well be that 5 years from now, you'll have development job market candidates who are getting up and saying, to understand the at-scale effects of this, I'm going to put this into a Bergquist et al. Model, or maybe they'll just call it the Berkeley model or something, to understand the GE effects of this. So along those lines, I just wanted to ask a couple of questions. So the first one, and now I'm at ASU, so I'm going to ask a question that probably Ed Prescott would ask, which is whether or not the first welfare theorem holds here. Because the first thing you want to think about in a situation like this is it's sort of strange to think about an at-scale policy intervention in a model, if the model is efficient, in a model in which there's no need for a policy intervention, right? And so that's sort of something to keep in the back of your mind. I think actually for this paper, that's probably not something you need to worry about so much. But the way I'm thinking about it is if the goal is for people to be able to augment it further, if I add in some kind of frictions, is that going to make it so that the solution method still works? And I don't understand the solution method well enough to be able to see whether it's obvious, if it will or will not work. But that's just something to have in mind, because I think what people are going to want to do, and I think Kevin was asking a question along these lines in chat, if people start putting in frictions, is that going to make it so the solution method doesn't work anymore? And if that's the case, that's going to be that's going to sort of limit what people can do with it. And you know, the Mallet's model, the neoclassical growth model, most of these canonical models are efficient. So the question is really what happens when people start doing augmentations of it. But even if that were true, you could still do things like, you could ask questions about like optimal road networks. You could think about like public good provision and the best way to do it within the context of the model, even if it is efficient. So, you know, there's still a lot you can do with it. And then the other issue that sort of came to mind for me reading the paper was in development these days, people talk a lot about targeting in the network context, and usually they're thinking about it in the context of individuals. So who within a community, if I can only do it on a subset of people, who should I pick to target with my intervention? But here you could actually think about something I think would be really interesting, which is like spatial targeting. You know, if you ever try to do an intervention, you know that like the cost of the intervention depends a lot on how many locations in which you're doing it. And so you could very easily imagine situations where a government is saying, okay, well, we can only do this in 10% of locations. And so I think the model could actually give you a lot of really interesting insights into what 10% of locations I should choose, taking into account like this network structure, taking into account these like GE effects. And so it could kind of give you information about what characteristics of locations actually determine where policies have the most important impacts. Okay, sorry, I'm rambling a bit. So I'll let you respond first, and then, like I said, if people have questions, if they want to ask the whole group, then please just go to the chat box and say, I have a question, and then I'll call on you after Lauren responds. Thanks.
Great, so thanks Wyatt for those comments. Really appreciate that. So I think there's maybe two big comments to respond to there. So the first is, you know, yes, the first welfare theorem holds here. Yes, you're right. There's no inefficiencies in the current model. We've kind of gone back and forth as to whether we should bring them in. I mean, one of the challenges that I think, as you said, it would complicate the model. And we've been trying to, I think, present this kind of new methodology in the most streamlined way as possible. We've thought about potentially adding an appendix where you add in something like, for example, you know, you could think about credit constraints being sort of rationalization for fertilizer subsidy programs, et cetera. So we thought about bringing those in. I don't think there's not an obvious reason why the solution method would not work with frictions, but we'd have to, or sorry, with market inefficiencies, but we'd have to work it through. I should say probably currently what we're doing, which is just shocking productivity. If you want to think of, you know, what inefficiency could be most akin to that would be sort of thinking about there being information inefficiencies. So one of the rationales that, you know, some governments use for why you might want to subsidize fertilizer is farmers might just not know how productive it is on their land. So you can think of this like, oh, they wake up one day and are suddenly more aware of the fact that it's more productive on their land. But we can work through other ones and see how that affects our results. I agree that would be the next step, is adapting this to different particular situations. The second thing you mentioned is targeting, which I think is really important. And this model, I think, is well set up to look at that. So the counterfactual that I showed you today was, you know, what if you run this intervention in, actually what I showed you was a nationally representative sample, and then looking down about, you know, what if you ran it in this area versus that. But of course, that's not how actual policies are run. And so you can imagine targeting, as you mentioned, at the spatial level, and we can look at that in our model, or you could target based on type of farmers. So for example, many, you know, fertilizer subsidy programs, which is just the one example we gave, are often targeted at farmers who have, you know, land holdings between certain sizes. And so you can run that through the model as well. And the model is, I think, well, you know, amenable to all of those approaches.
That's great. Okay, so let's see. If anyone has questions, feel free to let me know. It looks like Ben has been answering a lot of them in the chat as well. Oh, I see Ryan just put in a question. If you'd like, you could ask that to the whole group. Or maybe I can just read it off.
Okay.
Okay. Or Richard, sorry, Richard, why don't you go ahead and ask your question to the group?
Sure, thanks. I had I mean, it's a fascinating paper and there's a lot to take in. I had a question about interpreting one set of numbers you presented. You had that one graph with the density where you said that you could either be plus 10% or minus 10% relative to the treatment. Mm-hmm. And I guess I'm thinking, am I correct in thinking those numbers? Suppose I thought the treatment was 10%, and then you're telling me there's a plus or minus 10%. Does that mean we're going from 10 to 11 or 10 to 9, or does it mean 10 to 0 and 10 to 20? If it's 10 to 9 and 10 to 11, I would have said in the grand scheme of things, that's actually doesn't seem like a big deal. We do a massive experiment, this 90% subsidy, and you're telling me, well, if you just told me it varies between 9 and 11, then we've kind of pinned it down.
Yeah, so that's percentage points in welfare. So this is saying this is percentage points difference. So this is saying it's the difference between the local effect and the at scale effect. And so yes, so if you estimate sort of a 10 percentage point gain in your local intervention, this is saying here, well, let me give you 11 percentage points. So this is saying 11 percentage points in your local intervention. This is saying your at scale is going to be 1 percentage points change in welfare. Yeah, so it's quite large. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, and if you want to know on average, it's about a 1 or 1.5 percentage point difference between local and at scale on average in terms of a nationally representative sample.
Great. Okay. If anyone else has a question, you can add it to the chat or let me know in the chat. I'm also going to read off Ryan's question. He says, the objectives of this paper look very interesting. Do you believe that this toolkit that you developed can be directly used by policymakers, such as in Uganda, to test the effect of certain agricultural policies on economic growth?
So our hope is that it will really be useful. Certainly it's a fairly complex model. So, you know, this may require, I think, you know, like the composition of co-authors in this paper, this may require, you know, the sort of joint initiative of folks who do the more applied micro stuff and folks who do more of the trade modeling. But yeah, I think the hope is that, I mean, I think ideally what we want is this would be actually combined with local RCTs. So you can imagine, for example, if you ran an RCT, and you could estimate, for example, right now we're feeding in the productivity shock. You could estimate that in your local RCT. If you measure also things like land allocation, you can estimate even some of the key elasticities in your local RCT. For example, you can estimate that kappa, that key supply elasticity. I think in our really ideal world, you'd also think about combining some of these approaches from micro-experimental development economics. So doing things like randomized saturation designs in conjunction with this could help you think about validating the model, I think, in a really nice way. So yeah, our hope is this actually is useful, and we're planning on writing, I should say, we're in the process of writing an appendix that will hopefully break down what you need to actually use this in practice. You know, one of the things is on things like research design that I just mentioned. So there's useful aspects if you can have sort of two-stage randomization where you can validate the model internally looking sort of at almost local GE effects. But there's even some basic things on things like what data do you collect. So I was sort of surprised we had actually looked to try to find an existing RCT to use as an example here. And one of the challenges we found is that many RCTs capture input usage and outputs related to the crop that's being particularly targeted in the intervention, but they often won't collect inputs and outputs by crop for other crops. And that is one thing that's necessary here. So we'll try to lay out sort of all the data you want to collect to actually estimate this model, which we hope would be of use to folks who want to use it in practice.
Okay, great. And we'll give the last question to Julieta.
Yeah, I just had a question on the uses. So here it seems that the logic goes from, I have all these experimental elasticities that I have estimated. I'm going to put them into the model to estimate the GE effect. To what extent do you think that the framework can be used to inform the way you say you design your saturation, for example, or differential saturation on locations? So I think that the model could be informative the other way around, right?
Absolutely. So I think you would ideally sort of want to run this ahead of time, probably with some best guesses as to what these elasticities look like. That might also tell you, as you said, like what's the right saturation design? Should we expect to see local price changes from these randomized saturation designs, given our best guess about these supply and demand elasticities? This is like going to be like basically a power calculation almost coming from this model to think about how to set up experimental work that could capture these GE forces. So yes, I think there'd be a great sort of interplay of get your observational data and your best guesses for these parameters, run the model first, have that inform your design, and then validate the model given your experimental work.
Great. Well, we finished exactly on time. So thanks for that. Yeah, so I'll turn it back over to Julieta.